Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I will start in about 30 seconds, please. Okay, welcome back. If you would turn, please, to page 89, you're probably already there. I would like to start our public meeting. I will now officially open the public meeting. It's held under the Planning Act. I advise all those in attendance that the Ontario Municipal Board has the power under the Planning Act to dismiss an appeal to either a zoning bylaw and/or an official plan amendment. If the appellant does not make oral submissions at the public meeting tonight or does not make written submission to Norfolk County Council before the zoning bylaw is passed and/or the official plan amendment is adopted. And again, remind you, if you're here in attendance, these meetings are televised, they are web streamed, and all items discussed in the public meeting are a matter of public record. We'll go to our one application. It is a staff report, DCS 1719. It concerns general zoning amendments to our Norfolk zoning bylaw 1Z 2014. I will now open the public meeting on DCS 17-19. Ms. Shannon Van Dalen is here, and I'm going to ask you if you wish to present the report.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. I will present the report.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, council, staff, and members of the public. This public meeting is with respect to general housekeeping amendments to the Norfolk County zoning bylaw. This report was presented to council in July of 2016 and included a number of items to streamline the development process and help clarify wording within the zoning bylaw. It included some amendments and provisions to respond to comments received from internally from a staffing perspective, as well from members of our development and community. The intent of the amendments is to, like I said, streamline the process and address areas of concerns that have been identified within the zoning bylaw to promote flexibility and assist with development within the county. The report includes amendments regarding building height, a definition, as well as zone provisions. It includes parking for vacation homes as well as visitor parking, definitions for a pier, dock, or wharf, residential units and commercial buildings, and some general provisions regarding site plan control, site triangles, and minimum services. These items are essentially the same as the report that was brought forward in July of 2016. There are two changes that you will find in the report and the presentation. The one being that in the original report, farm definition and bunkhouses were included within the report for amendments within the zoning bylaw. Those have been removed at this time. Staff continue to work with our community and our agricultural advisory board in terms of identifying and working through an appropriate definition and process for how to deal with farms and bunkhouses. So that will be brought forward via a separate report and amendment later, hopefully this year. We're also reviewing that as part of the official plan review to ensure the consistency between the two documents. Included within this report, which is new, is the item for residential uses within commercial buildings. That is a wording change in the current definition for residential components within our central business district. The provision speaks to residential apartments. The simple change to that provision changes the word residential apartment to residential unit, and this recognizes one or two units for residential purposes within the commercial building, and sets on different provisions in terms of a single apartment or a couple apartments as opposed to the classification of an apartment building, so to speak. Through the original report in July, concerns were raised in terms of public notification and consultation. In follow-up to the July meeting, we did hold an open house in October to raise this item and flag it. There has been public notification as well as ongoing conversations with our Agricultural Advisory Board, our Tourism and Economic Development Committee, as well as our Development Information Group, all of which the Development Information Sessions, they did receive a copy of the draft bylaw, and we did receive some feedback and valuable information in terms of the circulation on that. And also I'd like to note that just before this meeting, we did receive one letter of concern in terms of the building height for resort residential zones. The concern was that they would like to see the resort residential building height increased from 7.5 meters to 11 meters. The resort residential zone was not included in terms of the increase in the height as proposed through this general amendment. And the buildings are essentially, height is limited to the residential, urban and hamlet zones. The reasoning that the resort residential node was not included at this time is relating back to the Norfolk County official plan and the Lakeshore secondary plan and urban design guidelines that are identified in there. Within that document, the height is strictly identified in policy as shall not exceed 7.5 meters. So that is why we are not including it as a housekeeping item at this time. The inclusion within policy is beyond the scope of a general housekeeping amendment and warrants further investigation and review through a separate report. And that'll be addressed through some of the official plan review and updates. And like I said, we'll also follow as a separate review and component to that. Based on the foregoing and the information that we have received back in follow-up to the public consultation and information that we've received from our development group, we are recommending support of the proposed amendments to the Norfolk County zoning bylaw, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Very well done. Thank you. Councillor Black, questions, and then Councillor Oliver, please.
Mayor Luke, thank you very much, through you, to staff. Very good report, well-deserved drink of water. So, now I just wondered about the three definitions of dock, pier, and wharf. They all seem the same to me. I mean, they're slightly different, but I'm not overly concerned about it, but why did you split it up into three? I really don't see a big difference between them. Like, why couldn't you just stuck it in one, all the same?
To you, Mr. Mayor, I would agree that they are very similar in terms of the definitions. It was an item that was identified through some of the Lakeshore and the Hastings Drive processes and appeals and hearings that were identified through there. And as part of that, the thought from our building department as well was to break them out into individuals so that it really clarifies and identifies what the differences are, so that in a way that the arguments can't be made for one or the other.
Although I still can't see a real big difference, but whatever. Yeah, my other concern is it's site triangles 3.31.1, and if you look in the proposed section at the bottom, it does say that any building structure that would obstruct or impact the vision of a motor vehicle operator or any fence or vegetation exceeding a meter in height above the finished grade shall be prohibited with any sight line or sight triangle. This provision shall not apply to field crops. That's the problem I'm having. Why are we not, why do we exempt field crops? I can understand, yes, some soybeans or some field crops, it's not a problem. But if you got a tall crop such as corn or even tobacco, it can be a problem and affect the site triangle. So why are we exempting that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the exemption for agricultural crops, the thought process is that they're not permanent. They're there on a temporary basis, so they can be, they will be removed. They're not on a permanent basis, so they will be removed after a short period of time. It's a temporal issue, whereas if you have other vegetation, trees, or landscaping, it's there all the time and it grows and it matures for an indefinite period, and not to impact in terms of agricultural operations and normal farm practices. That's why those the crops have been exempt from the requirement.
But during that temporary time, they still create a problem, a visual problem for vehicles. So I still don't, okay, you've answered that question. Is there any legislation? Like, does OMAFRA or anybody trump our official plan or PPS or anything that we could do?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in terms of trumping, I'm not aware of anything from OMAFRA in terms of the requirements that would step in. I know through some previous discussions that if there becomes an issue on a site-by-site or case-by-case basis where it is impacting an intersection, Public Works has noted that through the roads department, they will make efforts to either contact the owner in terms of crop removal or go in and remove it if there is a specific safety concern on that matter.
Okay, and that's identified by who? By an individual bringing it to staff's attention or staff themselves? Or?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it would be could be identified through a variety of methods, either by county staff who are out and notice it, or if there is a complaint filed in terms of the intersection, our enforcement department would follow up on that also.
Okay, and what if there is an accident and the county has this exemption policy? Would the county not be liable?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm not in a
I don't know if
position to
there's a
answer
staff
that.
member that could address that.
You just will have to ask a judge that when it happens.
A judge? If Shelley was here, maybe she could address it. But okay, I've got my answers.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Oliver?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I apologize first of all to staff for having my back to them, but I do want to be able to refer to the report as I go.
Sure.
And to Shannon. Shannon, as you might have expected, my first question does relate to your comment with respect to the exclusion of a vacation home maximum building heights under the section that we're going to change. This is on page 92 of our agenda. And I'm not surprised to hear what you've said. We're addressing this, first of all, through the OP, and we know there is now a recommendation in the issues and options report that committee dealt with last week, Mr. Mayor, and we'll finish next week, that does recommend that we change the OP to get it to a 9-meter maximum, which is what we had in our zoning bylaw after council had approved it. So my question to staff is, what will be the timing? I realize we may be faced with a chicken and egg situation here. Let's just assume optimistically that by the fall of 2017, we have completed the update to our official plan, which will then have policy in it that says within the resort residential communities, the maximum building height can be 9 meters. That's what we've said we want, and staff are addressing that. How quickly after that will we be able to amend our zoning bylaw to take the maximum building height back up to 9 meters, which is where we had it in the first place? What will be the timing for that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a challenging question to answer. Generally, our official plan review, we're hoping will be wrapped up by the end of 2017.
Yes.
Depending on which appeals come out of that and how long they take, and it's potentially that this could be an appealable issue. I would suggest that probably mid-2018, bringing a zoning bylaw amendment before council to a public meeting would be appropriate.
And in the interim, I know that the Committee of Adjustment is dealing with these requests on a one-off basis as they come to the committee, and I think people are generally okay with that, knowing that we are in a period of transition. Would there be anything illegal preventing council, should we decide to do so this evening as part of this general housekeeping change, to direct that we include vacation home maximum building height in this zoning amendment with a maximum stipulation of 9 meters, different from what's in the report of 11 for urban residential? Could we do it legally?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, my quick answer would be no. It's not consistent with the official plan at this time, as previously outlined to council, and I think that would be a grounds for an appeal. And also, it has not been provided in the public notice for this application, and therefore it would need to be.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll hope, Mr. Mayor, that it doesn't take till the middle of 2018, but I appreciate Pam's being realistic to us, I guess, on the timing. My second question is on page 96 of our agenda. This is section 4.9 relating to parking spaces, and once again it relates to the vacation home zoning and requirements. The proposal is to add the vacation home to the types of development that would require minimum parking spaces at 2, first of all. Am I correct? That is the part of the change, to add vacation home and require a minimum of 2 parking spaces for each dwelling unit.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is correct.
Okay, and is there any provision or any requirement for visitor parking spaces, which I see there is in the existing policy for a vacation home?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of existing requirements for visitor parking, the visitor parking applies to townhouses and apartment buildings and those types of units. Right now, the visitor parking is kind of combined into one policy, one provision under the bylaw. So what we're doing is separating it into its own section so that it's very clear when the visitor parking is required. Visitor parking is, as it stands right now, and this will continue to be carried forward, visitor parking is not required for single detached or semi-detached units, triplexes, fourplexes, or vacation homes.
Okay. That's the one I wanted to hear, and I realize it's probably in there, but I was slightly confused about it, so thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. I have a number of speakers. Councillor Height, please.
Thank you, Mayor Luke. Through you to staff, I also wanted to talk about the building height, but you mentioned that we can't change it. So is this basically this report, there's nothing in here we can change?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the building height is being proposed to be amended for the urban residential zones. So that would be the R1 through R1, R2, R3, 4, and 7. And what that does is increase the building height from the 9.2 meters, which is currently in the bylaw, to 11 meters. The reasoning and the statement in terms of the resort residential zone and we're not increasing it at this time is that within the Norfolk County official plan there is specific policy that states that building height for the resort residential zone shall not exceed 7.5 meters. So that is why it's not being included at this time with this report, because if it's changed through this report, if that zone is included in terms of the height, it's non-conforming to the official plan. So the official plan policies need to be amended before we can include the resort residential as part of the bylaw.
Okay, so what I just heard there, we're going to go away from the 9.2 because that was wrong in the first place, and most of the houses will be allowed 11 meters except for the resort areas. Now, this is where we're going to run into a bit of a problem because of the Conservation Authority now requires your house to be up higher from the water, 1.6 meters higher. So now I have to go back and tell the constituents of the lakeshore that they can build a cottage that is 17 feet high, maximum, because their cottage will start here. Your measurement is going to be from the floor. A two-story, there will be all flat roofs. By them changing the rules over here and there, and you not changing the rules here, how will people ever get anything done? They will have to come in for, like, what kind of approval process and fees are they looking at? Because almost all of these will be affected by this.
Through you again, Mr. Mayor. Again, if council wishes to increase the height in the resort residential area, it will first need to go through the official plan and then in the provisions of the zoning bylaw. So that's the process it needs to take. That's not included in today's report, nor has it been advertised.
Right, so I'll only have this mess for the next year and a half? Is that right? Like, I don't even understand how it ended up in our official plan, because in Haldeman, it's 11 meters straight across the entire county, including the lakeshore. So I don't really want to tell them to go and build in Haldeman, because they can build the cottage they want, but this rule with the raising of the flood level, they're going to have to come in here, they're going to have to go over there. It's just going to be this huge mess that these people are going to have to go through to get anything done for a year and a half. And we can't fix it, is what I'm hearing.
Through you again, Mr. Mayor, we can look at council's direction into increasing the height again through the official plan first and then the zoning bylaw. It needs to go through a public process, and as much as I respect your comments here this evening, Councillor Height, we also have many people on the opposition that don't want to see the height increased, and that needs to go through a public process so that council has all the information.
Okay, so yeah, the next one I'm going to deal with then is dock piers and wharfs. Is that permitted in all zones? Will that be what is on there?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the permissions, they're predominantly within the lakeshore or the hazard land zones where the boathouses are permitted. They're not specifically permitted within any of the zones per se. It's just the recognition and the definition of what is considered a pier, dock, or wharf.
Okay, so that's just the definition? Because not that I'm concerned that somebody's going to build a pier in the middle of a farmer's field, but they might want to on a river, say. And then I noticed your visitor parking on here, 1 visitor space for every 3 dwelling units. That's on the bottom of page 96. That seems like a ton. Are we not able to slow that down? Like I went over to Haldeman's to see how they do it, and they have 1 for 10. And I think that's pretty skimpy, but 1 for 3, you have a huge parking lot.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the parking spaces, that is what has been approved through the zoning bylaw and is in force and effect today. All this is doing, it's not changing any of the numbers, it's just separating that out into its own provision for clarity. If there is a desire to look at the parking standards, we would have to look at that and do a specific study or a review in terms of the parking and parking requirements as a whole. This is simply just to break that out. It's not changing any of the standards or proposing new standards, just to provide some clarity in the zoning bylaw in itself.
Okay, so when do we do the changes? As part of the official plan review? Because I'm not going to accept that number.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, the parking provisions are not tied to the official plan. It is a zone provision. So in terms of moving forward on that, there would have to be some council direction and for staff to look into this and review the parking provisions and the parking standards that are currently included within the zoning bylaw.
Okay, so you need a motion from us or a direction?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes.
Okay, I'll move the motion that staff look into that.
Well, we can't do that just yet. We're in the middle of a public meeting, and when we follow the procedure, then I'll look for direction.
Okay.
And at that time, I'll be glad to entertain any motions.
Okay, and
Okay.
then my last ones are on the site plan control. If I'm reading this correctly, you're looking for site plan control now for all of these zones? Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the site plan is already applicable for all these zones through the bylaw that was passed a few years ago. These zones are already subject to the site plan control, and which was approved by council. All this is doing is right now, the only way we have site plan control identified in our zoning bylaw is on the zoning schedules themselves. So what this is doing is taking the excerpt of that zoning bylaw that is in force and effect and putting it into the general provisions, so a person can open the bylaw and see exactly what zones are subject to site plan control, instead of having to open to the schedules and find a property specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Geisens.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, on the site triangles, Councillor Black talked about that growing corn on these may cause a problem. I guess he hasn't seen the size of corn planters nowadays, that you can't make that turn in that little corner that's going to even cause any problems. If I look at, I guess it goes over to the next page that says that the provision shall not apply to field crops or wire farm fence. So has that been straightened up, and that's going to stay there?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the amendment proposed through the bylaw as presented is to remove the requirement or the statement for a wire farm fence, and just leave it as this provision shall not apply to field crops. So it would remove the statement about wire farm fence, and the intent with this is to create consistency with the fence bylaw, which was approved separately under the Municipal Act process.
I guess my concern would be more if someone is keeping cattle. Are you telling me that they can't use a wire fence? You can see through the wire fence. The cattle keep the grass short, so I can't see there would be a problem with sightline.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of that, again, this is to create consistency with an existing bylaw that is in force and effect for the municipality, so that there isn't a confusion between the zoning bylaw and the fence bylaw. It's not intended to, if there is site visibility there, that generally won't be an issue or create the hazard. But again, it'd have to be kind of looked at on a site-by-site basis in terms of the property and the intersection and what is involved with the municipal right-of-way and the distances there.
Okay. The other question that Councillor Height just talked about was the height, I guess, in the resort residential. He asked a question: what is the height from the foundation, from the ground, to the peak, or is it from the foundation to the peak? Is it there? Sorry, did I miss it?
Through
He
you,
talks
Mr.
about the average of the finished grade or something when I
Through you,
read it.
Mr. Mayor.
Finished grade?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Shannon, my apologies.
My apologies. In terms of one of the proposed amendments, building height definition is included in terms of what's being proposed for changing for amendment as well. So currently, the building height is the vertical distance between the finished grade at the front of the building. And what we are proposing is to include the word average. So building height shall mean the vertical distance between the average finished grade of the ground at the front wall. And what this is intended to do is to take into consideration if you have a property that has say a little bit lower in one corner and higher ground in the other, so that it would take the average across the front. So in terms of the building height, it is measured as at the finished grade of the property upwards.
Okay, the other, page 95 for me, and I guess page 7 of 12, when we're talking about docks and piers and wharves, and this is, it says here, this is the response to the Hastings Drive bylaw. So basically, this is going to be an amendment to the former Norfolk Township bylaw, is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, it is an amendment to the county zoning bylaw to include the definitions within that. The driving factor behind it was some of the items that were raised through the Hastings Drive procedures and sessions there, and to include, again, the definition so it's understood which each of the different types of docking is.
Well, I thought that the Norfolk Township bylaw was still in vogue, is it not?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, you are correct, Councillor Geisens. The provisions of that bylaw will still be in force and effect. It's simply the definitions that will be found in the Norfolk zoning bylaw.
Okay. The other question that I have when we talk about proposed and changed, which one is going to take place? Is it the proposed or is it the changed? And the reason I'm asking that, if there's a difference that talks about, it leaves out, provided the clarity to the Hastings Drive, and we're talking about lakes and rivers, yet the other ones talk about, on the bottom here, that lakes and rivers. So theoretically those, so if somebody wanted to put a pier in Hastings Drive, they would be allowed to do that if they meet the criteria?
Through Mr. Mayor, in terms of the report, the charts have been broken down into existing, proposed, and change. The proposed is the actual proposed amendment, and the change, the proposed wording that is to be included within the amendment. The change portion of each of the charts, is to work on an explanation as to what is being changed, through that amendment. So it's to try and break down and give the explanation of the differences between what is existing and what is proposed. In terms of the permits of where things could be constructed, if they meet if they get the appropriate building permits or permits from the Conservation Authority, they would be allowed to construct one of the structures.
Okay, thank you.
Columbus, Brunton, and Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple questions here. Again, site triangles. Can you tell us, this site triangle, the distance, is it the distance from the center of the road, the middle of the intersection? Should that not be in there, the distance setback to form that site triangle? Should that not be in the definition?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the measurements and the definition, the site triangles are defined within the zoning bylaw, and that is not being proposed to be changed. This section is the item identified within the general provision in terms of the where and how they're measured. So there is a difference. They are defined, and it is identified at what point the 9 meters is measured back within the definition section of the zoning bylaw.
So you mentioned 9 meters, so should that 9 meters not be mentioned in there somewhere?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it is identified already in the zoning bylaw within the other section that deals specifically with the site triangles.
Okay, we just didn't have it. Now, what about forest? If there's a forest within the site triangle that's owned by a private property owner, how do we deal with that? There have been a couple situations where the sight lines at such intersections are not good.
If there is issues on a site-by-site basis or with respect to vegetation of that nature, there would need to be follow-up in terms with the property owner to get that situation cleared up and rectified, and it may result in some of those trees being cut down if there is a significant safety concern.
Okay, thank you. And the other one I've got a question on is on top of page 10 of 12 of the report. Talks about the first story of any dwelling unit constructed within the CBD zone shall be level with the established grade of the street. We have an issue in the town of Delhi on King Street, and I know Mr. Baird's quite familiar with it, and so are his bylaw people, where people that own these buildings rent out the front part of this for residential. And apparently they've got some kind of an agreement somewhere way back in the 1980s that permits them to do this. So would this proposal stop them from doing that and force them to rent it out as commercial?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is the case as it stands right now. The storefront at street level of a building is intended to be for retail, office, or service space. So that is what is existing currently in the zoning bylaw, and that is what will be maintained. The only change in this one is the wording of the first part there where it says apartment dwelling. We're proposing that to change to dwelling unit because, again, an apartment dwelling is a defined term with respect to apartments. So it is recognizing the dwelling unit as opposed, so you can have, said one or two or three residential components to it as opposed to an apartment dwelling building.
Okay, and would this then be enforceable by the bylaw personnel?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it is now. It is in force in effect at this time. So that if there is that situation, they would, bylaw enforcement has this policy in place now that would be able to be followed up on.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Brunton.
Thank you, Mayor Luke. You're enjoying this, Shannon? You got lots of water there? No. I'm the building height issue, I guess I'll start with that. Maximum height of 11 meters, and I guess my question is, you're saying that's in the OP for the resort area, correct? It isn't in there. Okay, so, and I'm looking at it from, and I'm not an architect by any means, but I see the way they build these houses today, if it's a two-story with a 612 or a 412 pitch roof, gets up there pretty high, and I'm wondering, have you looked at that, taken that into consideration when you looked at the 11 meters? Like all these houses today got these humongous roofs on them.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in terms of the official plan and zoning provisions, typically the official plan doesn't go so far in terms of setting height requirements or numbers within the bylaw. So within the urban areas, there is no requirement for height within the official plan. The Lakeshore secondary plan is a little bit unique in terms of it went a little bit further in established urban design guidelines, which then in turn put the 7.5 meter height for the resort residential. So in terms of the official plan, there's nothing in there right now that speaks to maximum heights. So it is in conformity with the official plan that way. The height in terms of 11 meters, as stated, it's something that was previously recognized through the former township bylaws, and the intent is to just go back to that. A lot of the times we do have variance applications coming in right now because the builders have their set buildings and they've been having these construction forms for a number of years. So in terms of the pitch, there's we've received a number of calls and inquiries and applications to change that slightly. Typically they don't get up to the 11 meters, but it just allows that flexibility in terms of dwelling construction unit design to allow them to have a varied streetscape and not to break up some of that uniformity in terms of the height and the designs.
Well, I guess my point is a lot of them build a single story with a big roof pitch, but if you build a two-story, I just wonder, so all they have to do is apply for minor variance if they happen to be at 12 meters? 1 meter, is that what would happen?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if they proposed, if this amendment is approved and it is increased to the 11 meters, if they wanted to go above that to say 12 or 13 meters, then they would have to submit a minor variance application and go through that process. And we would look at it on a site-by-site specific basis in terms of neighborhood characteristics, what's in the area, and make a recommendation based on that request at that time.
Okay, just a comment. I see I got a little note here on an email. MHBC Planning, you probably saw that one about they would like to see 11 meters across the board, and I assume that's in the resident or resort area too. Did you see that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes. In my opening statements, I did make mention
Sorry.
to that letter. It was received just before we started council meetings, but yes, we are aware. And unfortunately, at this time, our recommendation is that it cannot be included at this time because of the official plan issues with it being stated specifically in policy that the height shall not exceed 7.5 meters.
Okay, my next question is parking requirements. Is one in the garage, one in the driveway considered 2 spaces?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it is.
Thank you. And the other one I had here is, and I see about water and sewer connections when no problem in the urban definition, but am I reading this right that if 30, 50, or 100 acre farm wants to put in a building, they got to get a site plan? Is that the way I read that, or am I?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. Which section are you referring to at this
Well,
time?
I would say it's, let me see, site plan control, page 97 roughly we'll start on. It says, it goes through, and on the way I understand that the change provision, dwelling, that you're asking for a site plan, are you, or for in the rural area on a farm, if they put up, say, a barn or something, does that site plan apply or no?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no, it would not apply. What this is, the minimum services is dealing with servicing provisions. So the provision of water and sanitary, it's not dealing specifically with site plan control. And what this is currently under each of the zones, there is a requirement that properties connect to municipal water and municipal sanitary. What this amendment is doing is taking that requirement out of each of the zones specifically and including one general provision which would apply as a whole and allow some flexibility in terms if services are not available in an area due to some servicing constraints, topographical issues, or connection factors in terms of capacities, that our general manager of public works would have the authority to waive the requirement for the proponents to connect. Currently, if there isn't the services available, the proponent or the developer would have to go through a zoning amendment. So what this is an attempt to clean up the bylaw and streamline the process a little bit so that it would remove those requirements for zoning if services are just simply not available for an area.
Okay. And I think my other question was answered. Changed. Oh, so in the central business district, we're changing that the way I read it, or we propose to change it so the bottom floor can be residential. No?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there's the only change for this from what is currently permitted or what is currently worded is instead of the word apartment dwelling, we are changing it to dwelling unit. Because apartments are defined, we don't want the CBD to be necessarily tied to an apartment. So this would allow residential apartments to occur. They are permitted on the first floor as long as they're not in the storefront portion of the building, like the road frontage.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Oliver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for giving me one last shot with respect to the maximum building height thing. I want to question Shannon on what she said in response to questions from at least 2 other councillors on this, and that is that our existing official plan policy is specific about not exceeding 7.5. Well, I agree with that. I'm now concerned, Mr. Mayor, about the Lakeshore Community Design Guidelines, because that is a guideline, and that document, as I recall from when we first approved all of this 7 or 8 years ago, that's the one that says, to be consistent, we would like these cottage heights no more than 7.5, except where it's consistent with the neighborhood. And it can go higher to a height of 9 meters, for example, in the community design guidelines for resort residential. So my simple question is, assuming we proceed with amending the official plan document that's going to take it back up to 9 meters, will that by default then also change the community design guidelines for those resort residential communities? So we won't have someone still saying it's not in conformity with that. And I'm sorry if that's not clear, Mr. Mayor.
I know what you're getting at, yeah.
I can ask this question next week if you prefer.
No,
because we are going
this
to
is
deal
a
with
good
it then
time,
as
this is
well.
a good time,
Okay.
so.
Through
So,
you,
carry on,
through
sorry.
you, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Oliver, we understand the question.
All right.
And I think what you will see come out in the official plan review is some more flexible language. As Shannon outlined, it's not usual that we see specific numbers in an official plan. So we'll give council some options in that regard, but I think it would be best from a professional perspective not to have numbers in there, be a little bit more flexible with wording, and then that can be interpreted in zoning bylaws appropriate.
Okay. All right.
You okay?
I am
You're okay.
not happy, but I'm okay.
No, well, any other questions at this time to planning staff? Councillor Brunton?
Just one other request, Mayor Luke, if I may. When we do our next round of OP issues, could we get maps of the urban boundaries? I don't believe I have that.
Absolutely.
All right, for like Waterford, some.
Yeah, the urban areas.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further? Sorry about that. Okay, thank you, and thank you for those answers. Okay, is there anyone in attendance who wishes to speak in support of these proposed 6 amendments? It's more than 6, but 6 topics. And support that wishes to speak on these amendments? I hear none. Is there anyone who wishes to speak in opposition or just in general to these amendments? Anything further from council members? I will need a mover and seconder to close this public meeting. Councillor Oliver has moved. Councillor Geisens